On October 23, 1947, a wildfire traveling 6 miles in 3 hours incinerated 67 mansions belonging to the richest families in American history: Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, Pulitzer, Morgan, Astor, along with 5 grand hotels and 170 homes on a single island off the coast of Maine. Property damage exceeded $23 million. The cause of the fire was never determined. Here is the strange part. The fire did not kill Bar Harbor. The mansions were already dying before the flames arrived. And what replaced them, what grew from the ashes over 70 years, may have done something worse. That town, Bar Harbor, now has about 5,000 year-round residents. On a peak summer day, 15,000 visitors flood its waterfront. Nearly 4 million people pour through Acadia National Park every year. And in November of 2022, the residents of this tiny place did something almost no American town has ever done. They voted to turn the ships away. They passed a law capping cruise ship passengers at 1,000 per day, down from the thousands who used to swarm their streets from vessels the size of apartment buildings. The cruise industry sued. A federal judge got involved, and the legal battle that followed has split Bar Harbor in two, pitting neighbor against neighbor, shop owner against homeowner, tourism against survival. The town that once welcomed the wealthiest people in America is now fighting over whether it can afford to welcome anyone at all. But this story doesn't start with cruise ships. It doesn't even start with money. It starts with a painting. In September of 1844, a New York painter named Thomas Cole arrived on the northeast shore of Mount Desert Island. Cole was the founder of the Hudson River School, the most important landscape painting movement in American history. He'd been working his way up the Maine coast, Penobscot Bay, Beech Mountain, and when he reached Schooner Head, overlooking the Atlantic and the bare granite peaks that gave the island its French name, Ile des Monts Déserts, he pulled out his sketchbook. What he drew, and later painted in oils, moody, romantic, storm-swept vistas of sea crashing against mountains, would change the future of that island more completely than any railroad or hotel or highway ever could. Cole went back to New York and told everyone who mattered. He brought Frederick Edwin Church, his protege, the next year. Church painted, too. Those canvases sold. They hung in galleries in Boston, New York, Philadelphia. And the people who looked at them, wealthy, restless, fleeing the smoke and noise of industrialized cities, thought, I want to go there. They called themselves rusticators. They came by steamship and later by rail, clutching the idea that this wild coast could restore something that city life had taken from them. At first, they stayed in spare rooms in fishermen's houses. They ate plain food. They hiked. They breathed the salt air. It was simple, even austere. The town wasn't even called Bar Harbor yet. It was Eden, incorporated in 1796, named for an English statesman, though the biblical echo turned out to be prophetic. Eden, after all, is the place you eventually get expelled from. What happened next happened fast. Faster, maybe, than anyone on the island could have prepared for. By 1855, the first real hotel appeared, the Agamont House, built by a local named Tobias Roberts right on Main Street. By 1868, a man named Alpheus Hardy built the first summer cottage, a word that in the vocabulary of Gilded Age wealth meant a mansion with a view. That same year, the steamer Lewiston began regular passenger runs to Bar Harbor, and the floodgates opened. By 1870, 4 steamboats arrived daily. Telegraph service came in 1871. Suddenly, one of the most remote fishing villages on the eastern seaboard was connected, accessible, desirable. And then came the hotels. By 1881, there were 30 hotels on Mount Desert Island, 17 in Bar Harbor alone, and reservations were being made 2 years in advance. 2 years! Think about what that means. People were so desperate to spend a summer in this town that they were booking rooms before they knew what would happen in the next election. The most extraordinary of those hotels was the Rodick House, built by a local man named David Rodick on Main Street. It started as a guest house in 1866. By 1875, It had expanded to accommodate 275 guests. And then, in November 1881, 70 carpenters began work on a massive extension, 45 feet northward along Main Street, then 225 feet westward. When they finished, 9 months later, the Rodick House was 6 stories tall, with 400 guest rooms, not a single private bath, a dining hall that could seat 1,000 people at once, and a famous bar called the Fish Pond. It was advertised as the largest hotel in Maine. The lobby became Bar Harbor's social center, the place where deals were made, marriages arranged, summers planned. If you were a Rockefeller, a Carnegie, a Vanderbilt, or a Ford passing through town, the Rodick House was where you sat down. And the people who stayed at the Rodick House eventually decided that even the largest hotel in Maine wasn't quite enough. They wanted their own places, so they built them. The cottage era that followed was one of the most extravagant building booms in American history. By the time it peaked, there were 222 summer estates on Mount Desert Island. The families who built them read like a directory of American power: Joseph Pulitzer, William Proctor, Frederick Vanderbilt, George Vanderbilt, Evelyn Walsh McLean, who owned the Hope Diamond. J.P. Morgan docked his yacht in Frenchman Bay. The cottages were designed by the finest architects available. William Ralph Emerson popularized the shingle style here. Fred L. Savage designed estate after estate. One of them, the Archbold Cottage on Cleftstone Road, was an Italian villa. These weren't summer homes. They were monuments, and they lined the shore of Frenchman Bay in a stretch everyone called Millionaires Row. The money those families spent in Bar Harbor didn't just build cottages. It built an entire ecosystem of wealth. Each estate required a small army: groundskeepers, cooks, maids, laundresses, stable hands, coachmen, gardeners. Their parties needed caterers. Their carriages needed roads. Their yachts needed harbors. Their children needed entertainment. The Kibo Valley Golf Club opened in 1880, the oldest golf club in Maine. President Taft would play there in 1911. Yachting regattas filled Frenchman Bay with sails. Garden parties at the Pot and Kettle Club ran through the golden afternoons. There were concerts, lectures, extravagant balls, afternoon tea receptions, horse races, and picnics planned with the precision of military campaigns. A society newspaper in New York once devoted an entire column to the guest list at a single Bar Harbor luncheon. Picture what a visitor arriving by steamship in 1895 would have seen: the harbor thick with yachts, the grand hotels rising above the waterfront, carriages rolling down West Street past one mansion after another, shingle style, colonial revival, Italian villa, each one grander and more absurd than the last, the air smelling of salt water and money. This was not a vacation destination. This was a stage, and the performance was wealth itself. After Newport, Rhode Island, Bar Harbor was the most fashionable summer colony in America. Some said it had surpassed Newport entirely. But Newport had stone mansions. Bar Harbor had wood. Remember that. The scandals were part of the appeal. The wealthy didn't just bring their money to Bar Harbor. They brought their rivalries, their affairs, their feuds. The social columns of the era chronicled the summer wars of the cottage set with the same breathless attention that newspapers gave to actual wars. Who was invited to whose party? Who was pointedly not invited? Which new cottage was designed to outshine a neighbor's? Which marriage was arranged over cocktails at the Rodick House? And which one disintegrated at a Kibo Valley dinner? Meanwhile, something else was happening. Something quieter, more consequential, and far stranger. A Boston gentleman named George Bucknam Dorr was falling in love with the island. Not with its parties, with its mountains. Dorr was the heir to a New England textile fortune. Harvard-educated, Oxford-educated, unmarried, devoted to nature. He'd first visited Mount Desert Island in 1868 with his parents when he was 15. His father bought an oceanfront property at Compass Harbor. George eventually made it his primary home. And in 1901, when Harvard President Charles W. Eliot asked him to help form a group to preserve the island's scenic lands, Dorr threw himself into the project with an intensity that would consume the rest of his life and every dollar he had. What Dorr did over the next 4 decades is one of the most remarkable acts of conservation in American history. He schmoozed donations from his wealthy neighbors. He bought parcels of land out of his own pocket. He navigated hostile town politics, skeptical legislators, and jealous landowners. When World War I shifted Congress's priorities away from conservation, Dorr personally persuaded President Woodrow Wilson to use executive authority to designate the land as Sieur de Monts National Monument in 1916. In 1919, Wilson signed an act establishing Lafayette National Park, the first national park east of the Mississippi. Dorr became its first superintendent. In 1929, the name was changed to Acadia National Park. By the end of his life in 1944, Dorr had spent his entire fortune on the park. He was living on his meager superintendent's salary. He died in Bar Harbor, nearly broke, at the age of 90. His partner in all of this was John D. Rockefeller, Jr., who had purchased land near Seal Harbor in 1910. Rockefeller was an expert horseman who hated automobiles. Between 1913 and 1940, he personally designed and funded a 57-mile system of carriage roads through the mountains and valleys of Mount Desert Island. Broken stone roads 16 feet wide, with 17 hand-carved granite bridges, each one unique. The roads were motor-free. Rockefeller wanted to ride through the wilderness by horse and carriage, and he was rich enough to build an entire road network to make it possible. The cost, $3.5 million. He donated all of it, roads, bridges, 10,000 acres of land, to Acadia National Park. Here is the irony that will take decades to become visible. Dorr and Rockefeller created the park to protect the island from development. The park would preserve the mountains and forest forever. It would belong to the public, every American, regardless of class. Dorr, as one historian put it, democratized the island. But in saving the land, they created the single most powerful engine of tourism the island would ever know. Acadia National Park is now one of the 10 most visited national parks in the United States. In 2017, its visitation hit 3.5 million, a 60% increase from just 10 years earlier. By 2021, fueled by the pandemic-era hunger for outdoor spaces within driving distance of northeastern cities, the number crested 4 million for the first time on record. And every single one of those millions of visitors needs somewhere to eat, sleep, park, and shop. That somewhere is Bar Harbor, a town of 5,000 people at the end of a 2-lane road on an island. But the Gilded Age didn't end with the national park. It ended with something more mundane, a tax form. The federal income tax, introduced in 1913, began to erode the fortunes that built the cottages. The Depression hit next, and hard. By the late 1930s, many of the summer estates on Mount Desert Island were already empty, or for sale, or quietly deteriorating. Of the 222 cottages that had once stood, only 135 were occupied by the summer of 1947. The golden era was fading. It just hadn't received its death certificate yet. That certificate arrived on October 17, 1947, and it arrived by fire. The year 1947 became known across the state as the year Maine burned. An unusually warm spring had melted the snow early. Summer brought drought. Maine received only half its normal rainfall. Vegetation was brittle. Water supplies dwindled. By October, the entire state was a tinderbox. More than 200 fires burned across Maine that month, consuming 250,000 acres of forest, wiping out 9 entire towns, destroying 851 homes and 397 seasonal cottages, and leaving 2,500 people homeless. But the worst of those fires, the one that would destroy more wealth, more history, and more architectural beauty than any other hit Mount Desert Island, which by mid-October was experiencing the driest conditions ever recorded. On the afternoon of October 17th, a woman, most accounts identify her only as Mrs. Gilbert, called the Bar Harbor Fire Department to report smoke rising from a cranberry bog near Dolliver's Dump off Crooked Road near Hull's Cove. They went out, they fought it, but the fire had other plans. For 3 days it smoldered underground, barely visible. On October 21st, strong winds fanned it to life. 2,000 acres burned in a single day. Military personnel flew in: Army, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard. Forestry students from the University of Maine, theology students from Bangor, National Park Service employees from parks across the eastern United States. None of it was enough. On the morning of October 23rd, the wind shifted, pushing the fire toward Hull's Cove. Firefighters rushed to protect the village, and then, in the afternoon, the wind turned again, suddenly, violently, and increased to gale force. A dry, cold front was moving through. The fire reversed direction and charged straight toward Bar Harbor. In less than 3 hours, the wildfire covered 6 miles, cutting a 3-mile-wide path of destruction. It swept down Millionaires Row and consumed everything. The Malvern Hotel on Kibo Street. The Belmont Hotel at Mount Desert and Kibo. The De Gregoire Hotel at Eden and West Street. The Agamont House, the very first hotel ever built in Bar Harbor, the one Tobias Roberts had opened 92 years earlier. The Building of Arts, 67 summer cottages, 170 permanent homes. The Jackson Laboratory, a genetics research facility founded in 1929 that had become one of the most important biomedical institutions in the country. Its entire mouse colony, carefully bred genetic lines used in cancer research worldwide, was destroyed. Only later, when scientists at other institutions returned borrowed mice, were all but one strain saved. The fire trapped people. All roads out of Bar Harbor were blocked by flames and fallen trees. 2,000 residents gathered at the athletic field. When the fire advanced to the edge of town, they moved to the town pier. People sat in buses on the dock, staring across the water, waiting. One survivor later recalled, "I tried to walk around the town. I might just as well have tried to walk in my furnace." And then something happened that the people of Bar Harbor still talk about. Lobstermen from Winter Harbor, Prospect Harbor, Gouldsboro, and Lemoyne, neighboring fishing communities across Frenchman Bay, launched their boats into 60-knot winds and rough seas. These were men who risked their boats, their livelihoods, their lives. One account described them as crossing the bay, imperiling their treasure and their lives to pull roughly 400 people to safety by water. Meanwhile, firefighters deliberately dynamited the De Gregoire Hotel at West and Eden Streets, sacrificing one of the town's grandest buildings to create a fire break. Without that fuel, the blaze veered away from the heart of the village. The downtown business district, the shops, the stores, the churches, survived by what amounted to a calculated act of destruction. By 9 o'clock that night, bulldozers had carved a path through the burning wreckage on Route 3. A caravan of 700 cars carrying 2,000 people began the slow, terrifying drive to Ellsworth. Sparks pelted the windshields, flames arced overhead, trees collapsed across the road and had to be shoved aside. The convoy moved at a crawl, but it made it through. One family drove to Seal Harbor, then Northeast Harbor, then Somesville, then across the bridge to Ellsworth. A 4.5-year-old boy named Jack Russell, riding with his mother, looked back from the Trenton Bridge and saw the mountains of Acadia on fire. That image stayed with him for the rest of his life. The fire blew itself out when it reached the ocean near Schooner Head, the very same headland where Thomas Cole had sat with his sketchbook 103 years earlier. It was declared under control on October 27th, but smoldered underground until November 14th, nearly a month after it had begun. In all, 17,188 acres burned, more than half of those inside Acadia National Park. Property damage exceeded $23 million. Remarkably, no one in Bar Harbor died directly from the flames, though a few died of heart attacks and car crashes during the evacuation. When the residents came back, some after 2 days sleeping on floors in the Ellsworth Municipal Building, some after a week with farm families in the surrounding towns, they found a landscape that looked like the end of the world. Stone steps led nowhere. The mansions above them were gone. Massive arched foundations stood exposed, their houses vanished. Chimneys stood alone in fields of ash. The Malvern Hotel was a single chimney rising from a pile of rubble. The forests of Acadia, which had been dense spruce and fir, were charred stumps. In the years that followed, the evergreen forest would not grow back. Instead, birch, aspen, and other deciduous trees sprouted from seeds blown in on the wind. That's why Acadia has such spectacular fall foliage today. The fire rewrote the island's ecology. The year-round residents rebuilt. Most of the cottages did not come back. The families who had built them, already weakened by income taxes, the Depression, and 2 world wars, simply walked away. Some collected insurance and never returned. The estates on Millionaires Row were replaced by motels. The Rodick House had already been demolished in 1906, but the grand hotels that had survived it, the Malvern, the Belmont, the De Gregoire, were now ash. Joyce Butler, who was a young girl in 1947 and grew up to write the definitive history of the fires, put it plainly. Millionaires Row along Frenchman Bay is now lined with motels. Bar Harbor's economy, once tied to its cottage owners, now depends on its tourists. That single sentence describes one of the largest economic identity shifts any American town has ever undergone. Bar Harbor went from a place where the ultra-wealthy spent entire summers employing local people year-round, building institutions, funding a hospital, a library, a genetics laboratory, a national park, to a place where strangers arrive for a few hours, buy a lobster roll, snap a photograph, and leave. The money changed, not just in amount, but in kind. Cottage money was rooted. Tourist money passes through. In 1918, the town had changed its name from Eden to Bar Harbor, reportedly because mail kept being misdelivered to another place on the island, also called Eden. The name came from the sandbar that connects Mount Desert Island to tiny Bar Island at low tide. Walk across it at the wrong time, and the tide comes in behind you. You're stranded on a rocky island until the water recedes. The bar appears and disappears, appears and disappears, reliable but temporary. It's hard to think of a better metaphor for the town it gave its name to. For a while, the new tourism economy worked. Through the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, Bar Harbor reinvented itself as a more democratic destination. You didn't need a Vanderbilt fortune to visit. You needed a car, a few vacation days, and a reservation at one of the motels that now lined Route 3, where the mansions had been. In 1950, the old Mount Desert Reading Room was converted into the Bar Harbor Inn. In 2003, a developer built the Bar Harbor Grand Hotel on Main Street, a deliberate replica of the Rodick House, designed from old photographs. The architect studied the details through a magnifying glass. The original had been wood and ambition. The replica was steel and nostalgia. Acadia National Park was the draw. The town was the amenity. The ferry to Nova Scotia brought Canadian visitors. The Jackson Lab brought scientists and their families. The College of the Atlantic, founded in 1969, brought students who studied human ecology on the very island that was becoming a case study in the subject. Bar Harbor was smaller, simpler, less extravagant than its Gilded Age self, but it was alive and it was balanced. Then the cruise ships discovered Bar Harbor. In 1990, 22 cruise ships visited the port. By 2016, there were 106, carrying roughly 169,000 passengers. By 2019, the last full year before the pandemic, 179 ships brought 270,000 passengers. The growth was staggering. In less than 30 years, cruise traffic had increased nearly tenfold. Bar Harbor has no cruise terminal. The ships are too large to dock. They anchor in Frenchman Bay and send passengers ashore on small tender boats. On a peak day, as many as 5,500 cruise passengers could flood into a town whose entire year-round population was barely more than that. They came off the tenders, walked through the waterfront, ate lunch, bought souvenirs, maybe took a bus tour through Acadia, and went back to their ships. Most spent 4 to 6 hours ashore. A 2016 University of Maine study found that cruise tourists spent about $15 million in Bar Harbor that year, with a total economic impact of roughly $20 million. The town collected about $700,000 in passenger fees alone. That's real money, especially for shop owners, restaurants, tour operators, and the town treasury. One gift shop owner estimated that cruise passengers accounted for 20 to 40% of her annual revenue. For some businesses, the cruise season was the difference between profit and closure. But the numbers told only part of the story. For the people who actually lived in Bar Harbor, the cruise ships turned their town into something they no longer recognized. On peak days, 15,000 visitors packed a waterfront designed for a fraction of that. Main Street became impassable. Parking vanished. Locals couldn't run basic errands, couldn't get to the post office, couldn't pick up prescriptions, couldn't drive through their own downtown without sitting in traffic created by people who would be gone by sunset. And a growing number of residents began to argue that the cruise passengers, who ate on the ship, slept on the ship, and spent only a handful of dollars in town, were actually driving away the more valuable tourists, the ones who booked hotel rooms for 3 or 4 nights, ate dinner at local restaurants, hired local guides, and spent real money. By 2019, the tension had become unbearable. Town Councilor Gary Friedman, one of the most influential voices on cruise ship policy, proposed limits: 100 ships per year, no more than 2,500 passengers per vessel, a cap of 100,000 passengers annually. But the voluntary agreements between the town and the cruise lines hadn't stopped the growth. Something more dramatic was coming. In November 2022, the residents of Bar Harbor voted on a citizen-initiated ballot measure. The question: should the town cap cruise ship passenger disembarkations at 1,000 per day? It passed with 58.3% of the vote. For a town that depends on tourism, it was an extraordinary act of self-defense, or self-destruction, depending on who you ask. The reaction was immediate. A coalition of local business owners, the Pilots Association, and the operator of the piers where tenders docked sued the town in federal court. Their argument: the cap violated interstate commerce and would devastate local businesses. Some shop owners said 20 to 40% of their annual revenue came from cruise passengers. They were staring at potential ruin. The case went to U.S. District Court Judge Lance Walker in Bangor. In February 2024, Walker sided with the town, ruling that Bar Harbor had the home rule authority to limit disembarkations. The business owners appealed. The First Circuit Court of Appeals upheld most of the lower court's findings, but sent one question back. Was the 1,000-passenger cap clearly excessive when it came to burdening interstate commerce? In May 2026, Judge Walker issued a new ruling. He concluded that the 1,000-passenger cap was justified during July and August, the peak summer months when overcrowding was worst, but was clearly excessive during the shoulder seasons of spring and fall. The cap, in other words, could only be enforced part of the year. It was a split decision that satisfied almost nobody. Meanwhile, the cruise lines had already started shifting their ships elsewhere. Some rerouted to Portland, Maine, which has actual piers and can handle large vessels. Portland's 2024 cruise roster, 143 calls with capacity for 230,000 passengers, made it the state's busiest cruise port, surpassing Bar Harbor for the first time. Others simply skipped Maine altogether. For the 2026 season, Bar Harbor is expecting roughly 50,000 cruise passengers, a fraction of the pre-pandemic peak. The vast majority of scheduled visits are small ships operated by American cruise lines, carrying fewer than 150 passengers each. The giant vessels, the Norwegians, the Hollands, the Royals, are largely gone. The town's cruise-related revenue for 2026 is projected at about $255,000. Compare that to the millions the cruise industry once pumped through Bar Harbor's waterfront. But here's what makes the Bar Harbor story different from a simple fight over cruise ships. The cruise ship battle is just the most visible symptom of a much deeper problem. The real crisis is this: the people who live in Bar Harbor can barely afford to live in Bar Harbor. Acadia National Park drew nearly 4 million visitors in 2024, one of the busiest years on record. Those visitors need places to stay, and over the past decade, a wave of short-term vacation rentals, Airbnb, VRBO, has swept through Bar Harbor like a second fire. Investors began buying properties, sometimes sight unseen, sometimes above asking price, and converting them into nightly rentals. A house that once rented to a year-round family for $1,000 a month could earn that in a single week on Airbnb. By 2021, roughly 700 licensed short-term vacation rentals operated in town, in a place with only about 2,500 total housing units. The math is devastating. Every house that becomes a vacation rental is a house that can no longer shelter a teacher, a firefighter, a park ranger, a lobsterman, or a restaurant worker. And those are exactly the people Bar Harbor needs to function. The Acadia National Park superintendent told an advisory committee that the park wanted to hire 150 to 165 seasonal workers, but could only find about 116 because there was nowhere for them to live. Restaurants couldn't staff kitchens, hotels couldn't find housekeepers. The tourism economy was starving itself. In 2021, Bar Harbor voters approved restrictions on short-term rentals, capping non-owner-occupied units at 9% of the housing stock. But investors rushed to beat the deadline, and the number of such units roughly doubled before the rules took effect. The town now finds itself decades away from reaching its own cap. A housing study projected a need for more than 600 additional units through 2035. One longtime resident put the situation in terms that cut through all the policy language. He said that when he built his house in 1983, kids ran up and down the street all year long. Now, in winter, the neighborhood is dark. Most of the homes are employee housing, vacation rentals, or sitting empty. He said, "I don't want to live in an empty town." That phrase haunts Bar Harbor more than any fire story. An empty town. Not empty because people left, empty because they were replaced. Replaced by tourists who come for a day and go. Replaced by investors who buy houses they'll never live in. Replaced by visitors who love the town so much that their love has made it uninhabitable for the people who actually make it work. The situation has become, in the words of one town councilor, a housing crisis. The median age in Bar Harbor is nearly 50. Well above the national average. Young families can't afford to buy. Workers can't afford to rent. The town and Acadia National Park are now collaborating on a workforce housing project, trying to build affordable units on land the two entities share. The rough cost split is 27% town, 73% park. It is still in its infancy. The irony is inescapable. The national park has to help build housing because the national park's success has made housing unaffordable. The Jackson Laboratory, the genetics research institution that burned in 1947, rebuilt itself with donations from scientists worldwide and went on to become one of the most important biomedical facilities in America. It survived a second fire in 1989 that destroyed more than half its mouse collection, requiring yet another worldwide rescue effort. Today, it employs over 3,000 people across multiple campuses, with 1,200 in Bar Harbor alone. When the fire destroyed its entire mouse colony, Clarence Cook Little, the lab's founder, supposedly looked at the ruins and said, "Now we can see the sea." It was the kind of joke a man makes when the alternative is despair. And it captured something true about Bar Harbor, that beneath every catastrophe, the beauty was still there. The mountains, the bay, the granite, the fog rolling in off the Atlantic. That beauty is the source of everything that has happened to Bar Harbor. The painters and the rusticators, the Vanderbilts and the Motels, the cruise ships and the Airbnbs. Every crisis this town has faced has been a crisis of desirability. Nobody ever stopped wanting to come to Bar Harbor. The problem has always been what that desire costs the place itself. George Dorr spent his entire fortune trying to protect this island for future generations. He succeeded. Acadia National Park is permanent, protected, magnificent. But he could not have predicted that protecting the land would channel 4 million visitors a year through a town of 5,000 people. He could not have predicted that the park would make the surrounding land so valuable that the people who maintain it could no longer afford to live near it. The conservation was a triumph. The consequences of the triumph are a crisis. There's a park in Bar Harbor now, on the corner of Eden and West Streets, called De Gregoire Green. It sits on the exact spot where the De Gregoire Hotel stood before firefighters blew it up to save the town. There's a stone monument dedicated to all the men and women who worked on the fire lines and behind the scenes during the Great Fire. A paved path connects it to the new multi-use trail along Route 3. It's peaceful. Tourists walk past it every day. Most of them have no idea what happened there. And so Bar Harbor sits today in a condition that would be recognizable to anyone who has watched a small American place collide with enormous outside forces. The town is beautiful. The park is extraordinary. The lobster rolls are excellent. The fall foliage, those birch and aspen trees that grew back after the fire replaced the old spruce forest, is spectacular. The summit of Cadillac Mountain, at 1,530 feet, the highest point on the Atlantic coast of the United States, still draws people at 4 in the morning to watch the sunrise, and the park now requires advance reservations just to drive up the road. Frenchman Bay is still the kind of water that makes you understand why the painters came. But the streets are jammed from June through October. The housing stock is hollowed out. The cruise ship fight is still in federal court. And beneath the surface, a question burns that no ballot measure or court ruling can fully answer. Who does a place like this belong to? The 4 million visitors who pay to experience it? The 5,000 residents who hold it together? The investors who profit from it? The memory of the families who built it and the fire that took it away? At low tide, you can still walk across the sandbar to Bar Island. The bar is right there. Solid ground, rocks and gravel, a path you can follow with your feet. But if you stay too long, or if you aren't paying attention, the water comes back. It rises fast, and then there's no path at all, just cold Atlantic water where the ground used to be, and the long wait for the tide to change.